In the shadow of the post, this campaign has now developed a tension not seen since 1993, when Paul Keating went to bed on election eve contemplating defeat at the hands of John Hewson and scored a resounding win the next night. To work through the various possibilities this time, including a win for either major party or a hung parliament, I spoke late today with the ABC's veteran election analyst Antony Green, who was in Canberra. Antony Green, it seems we could be looking at anything on Saturday night, from a win for Labor, a win for the coalition, or a hung parliament with either major party forming a minority government. Let's just start by looking at what either side has to win to form government. So there's 150 seats in the parliament. To form a government in their own right, either major party needs 76. Now, what can Labor afford to lose?
Well, they hold 83 seats in the parliament, but because of the redistribution, the starting point of this election is 88. And Labor can afford to lose 12 seats, which is a swing of about 1.4%, which gets them back to 76 and hanging on to a one-seat majority, two-seat majority. If they get beyond those 12 seats to 1.5%, 1.7% swing, they start to be in a minority position. If the coalition pick up 17 seats off Labor, 17-seat gain, then they'll have enough seats in Parliament to have a one or two-seat majority of their own right. And that's a swing of about 2.3%. But the key thing that's going on at this election is you can look at the national swing and you can look at the national polls, but the national polls don't make much sense unless you break them up by state. The
most recent of the major polls would suggest that Labor is heading for a narrow victory, but it's not as simple as that, is it?
Well, all the polls are showing a narrow Labor majority, 51, 52, that's about it. Now, they're all within a margin of error of 50% anyway, plus you've always got the difficulty of turning votes into seats. But every time you take one of those national polls, and all the pollsters combine 2 or 3 polls they've done through the campaign and break them down by state, whenever you take that state breakdown analysis, you end up with Labor barely getting a majority out of that vote. And the simple reason is most of the marginal seats at risk are in New South Wales and Queensland. That's where the biggest swings are. So if there's a big enough swing in New South Wales and Queensland, it's enough to deprive Labor of a majority, even if Labor does well enough across the rest of the country to get 50% or above.
Well, let's just quickly look at the state breakdown. How many seats are in play in Queensland?
Well, there's 10 seats on a margin of under 5%. I'd be surprised if the coalition won all, even if there was a 5% swing, I'd be slightly surprised if the coalition won all 10. There are some seats where there are peculiarities which might make it hard for the LNP to win up there. There is the new party, the LNP as well, which has had some teething difficulties in pre-selection.
Of course, there's also information emerging that Labor is worried about New South Wales more so than they have been. So New South Wales could even be a little bit of a shock for Labor. How many seats do you regard as being in play there?
Again, it's about half a dozen. There's seats around the fringes of Sydney which are at risk. Clearly, the state government and its failure to deliver services is generally damaging Labor's brand name in New South Wales, and that's flowing through to perceptions of the federal government as well. It will be interesting to see how that fringe of Sydney goes, where Labor is expected to do spectacularly badly next March at the state election. What's a bit harder to tell is whether some of the regional seats like Page on the north coast and Eden Monaro will do as badly as whether Labor will do as badly there as they are doing in Sydney itself.
So you could actually have different patterns of swings even within states.
That's certainly what's at issue at this election. I mean, there are some Labor seats. The redistribution has hugely complicated this as well, because you've seen seats moved around. The coalition at the last election was very good at defending its marginal seats right to the very edge of the borders of each of those marginal seats. And the borders have all changed and the booths have been moved around, and you get these funny-looking margins on all the new seats, which makes it complex to analyse. There are members moving seats, which complicates it further. But essentially, I mean, I'm quite happy on election night to sit there and watch the votes roll in each individual seat and pick each seat on its own. I don't think you'll be able to take any overall national trend. Certainly not a national trend, but even a state trend might not be very reliable for trying to pick which seats fall.
Now, it may also transpire, if Labor is to cling to power, that it may be saved by a small handful of seats in Victoria and South Australia. So what seats are in play, or what numbers of seats are in play in Victoria and South Australia?
Well, Labor may be advantaged by an increase in their vote, but there aren't many seats in play. That the battle lines between Labor and Liberal in South Australia and Victoria are pretty solid. They've solidified, and also there hasn't been a redistribution, which means the sitting members that were there last time are fighting the same boundaries. In South Australia, you've got Sturt, which is Christopher Pyne's seat, and Andrew Southcott's seat of Boothby. They'd be the only two seats in play for the Labor to gain. And in Victoria, you'd be talking about McEwen, the central seat, which was decided by only about 40 votes, and Latrobe in the eastern suburbs. But Labor also has to hang on to Corangamite and Deakin, which it won at the last election, and also try and prevent from losing Melbourne to the Greens.
There is a very real possibility on what we understand at this point that we could see a hung parliament. Now, just take me through the various permutations there, because not only have you got 3 independents, you've also got the possibility of a new Green member for the seat of Melbourne in Victoria.
Yes, although the Greens have said they would support a Labor government if elected. I can't see that if Labor ended up 1 seat short of majority, that you'd have anything other than a Labor government, because for a Green member to be elected and then bring down a Labor government would be astonishing, I think, at the federal level. The other thing is that there may be 1 Green in that balance of power in the House, but there'll be between 6 and 8 in the Senate who will hold exactly the same balance of power. If the Greens were to put the coalition in government in the lower house, it would make the Senate even more interesting, because the Greens would be even more important for getting legislation through the Senate than they would for the House.
What you're talking about is a situation where the coalition might win 72 seats and have to rely on 3 independents plus the Greens to form a government. And as you say, with the balance of power in the Senate in the hands of the Greens, that's when it gets really interesting.
No, the situation really depends on... If you look back at some previous scenarios, and Tony Windsor, one of the independents, has been through this situation. When Nick Greiner lost his majority in New South Wales in 1991, he needed 1 extra seat, which was Tony Windsor, and then general agreement with the three crossbench independents. Now, if there was 3 independents and the Greens, you'd see a similar situation. Labor would first talk to the Greens, and then the other independents would be there as well. It really does depend how much short of a majority you are. The 2002 South Australian election, the Rann Labor government party ended up 1 seat short of majority. They only needed 1 of the crossbench minor parties and independents to cross the floor, and the most conservative of them was the one that jumped. And so if Labor or the Liberals end up 1 seat, whether the 3 crossbench independents would vote as a bloc, or whether one of them would choose to support the government more solidly than the other, that'll be up for negotiations. I mean, we really need to see the numbers in the Parliament before we start trying to work out the scenarios on this. It really will depend on each independent as they're elected. What are the numbers for the major parties? I would expect them to support whichever party has more seats in the Parliament. It's much easier for an independent to support the party with more seats, because you can at least abstain on votes. If you support the party with fewer seats, and you keep finding yourself having to support them all the time.
Yes, of course, you could have 73-73-4. That gets interesting again.
Well, we've just done 10-10-5 in Tasmania, so I don't see why we shouldn't have that at the federal level.
Well, whichever way it goes, it's going to be interesting on the night. See you Saturday. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.